I tried to upload this second part several times and it choked, so I'm redoing it at a lower resolution. I think I can sort out the pipeline, but regardless, I'm quite serious about keeping on the time track for this. So here we go. This is calling me to account. The first video, as I already mentioned, was meant to be half, and I'm trying to keep lecture that I'm recording for you each week, regardless of how many pieces are, totaling to 2 hours or fewer. So with that in mind, noting that the sort of syllabus exposition that I uploaded came to an hour and a half, then I have 29 minutes and 30 seconds. So given that, probably what I'm in fact going to do here is give you a brief introduction, less to Carl Jung himself and more to myself. I know that's what you signed up for, right? The idea here being that, if we were in class, obviously I would introduce myself, to some extent. And I think that this can be sort of useful both because, we are going to attempt to form some personal relationships with each other, but also just because you can get a sense of kind of where I'm coming to the material from. And so what we'll do is we will pick up Jung himself next week. I have a bit of show and tell to get next week, and so we'll get into sort of life and times, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to do an introduction then try to cram a very complicated fellow into a relatively short period of time. I want to give that some breadth. Okay, so me, who am I? I'm your instructor, as I already pointed out. I'm Anderson Todd. Just for reference, for those who don't already know me, yes, I have a backwards name. So my first name is Anderson, like Anderson Cooper or Anderson Silva, and my last name is Todd. This is a backwards name. I don't know what my parents were thinking, since Anderson is actually a very common last name. Don't worry about it if you slip up and accidentally call me Todd. You'll get it. For reference sake, my middle name is Robert, so my initials are Art, A-R-T, which helps me remember. So I wouldn't worry about it. People almost inevitably slip up. It's not a big deal. This stopped bothering me a long time ago, probably in grade school, maybe like after about the 5th time that I had a grade school teacher say, "And what's your first name?" And I'd say Anderson, and she'd say, "Anderson is your last name." And I'd say, "I think I know what my name is, lady." So yes, my first name Anderson, last name Todd. Please just call me Anderson. I'm not Dr. Todd. We should get that out of the way now. I am not Dr. Todd. You can call me professor, I guess, in the colloquial sense. Technically speaking, I am not a professor. Professor is a reserved term for people who have tenure, and I don't have tenure. So technically, I'm Instructor Todd. I get it. Professor has become a colloquial, and there's lots of schools that don't use it in the formal sense. So if you want to use professor, you can, but not Mr. Todd, please. Mr. Todd isn't even my father. Mr. Todd is my grandfather or somebody. Anderson is fine. I'm going to refer to you by your first name unless you have an especially cool sounding last name, and likewise, please just call me Anderson. Okay. So who am I? Some of you have already taken classes with me, I know, and so you know me a little bit. For the rest of you, I'm an instructor at the university, obviously. So I teach the courses within the interdisciplinary courses in Jungian theory here at New College. That's a course suite, as I mentioned, which was originally funded by a generous endowment from the Woodmans, Ross and Marion Woodman, who established that course suite to further Jungian studies at the university and to bring, what they consider to be a quite important thinker, to more public exposure. We'll come around to that a little bit more and sort of Jung's status within the academy, which is always interesting. But I teach the interdisciplinary studies in Jungian theory, and also I teach or have taught in the past within the cognitive science course. So here within interdisciplinary courses in Jungian theory, I teach this full year course, which is the sort of 3rd year survey of Jungian and neo-Jungian and post-Jungian thinking. And within cognitive science, I have taught the first half of the intro course Cog 250. And I also, for a number of years, taught the fourth-year capstone course on consciousness, the cognitive science of consciousness. Also within the Jungian courses, I teach NEW302, which I know some of you have already taken. That's a course with a bunch of names: hypothesis of the unconscious, hypotheses of the unconscious, and I think in keeping with the subject matter, I deliberately choose not to clarify which one of those it is. I just refer to it by the various three, but I also teach that. And in some ways, I see that course on the unconscious and the coursework which I did, which is based fairly heavy in theoretical work that I did with John Vervaeke on the cognitive science of consciousness. I see those two pieces as kind of companion pieces. You don't have to have taken one to take the other, but if you do, the courses kind of talk to each other. So in the event that you're interested in this course, I do recommend hypotheses of the unconscious to you as well. If you find this course interesting, you will probably find that course interesting. It's a bit more scientifically inflected than this. Not that we don't get into science, but this isn't a cognitive science course. And so, we'll touch on some of that a little bit theoretically. My own work in the area around Jung has to do with sort of meshing together Jungian theory and trying to bring it into a more modern framework, often by use of cognitive science, which is itself quite interdisciplinary. So that's what I teach at the university. In addition to that, I'm involved in several other things at the university. So I've been the assistant director, and I'm one of the founding directors of the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory at UC. In that capacity, Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory, that's directed by John Vervaeke, who's a former professor of mine, a colleague. We've done a fair bit of co-authoring and work together, and he's a close friend. So at the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory, we founded that initially to investigate some sort of designs I had on the books for a machine to induce lucid dreaming. We'll talk more about lucid dreaming later in the course. That's a sort of a strong theoretical interest of mine. Subsequent to that, we've done quite a bit of work around, consciousness and wisdom, which are two topics that get a surprisingly small degree of attention within the academy. So among other things, we have a paper in the pipe. There we've done obviously lots of conference presentations and poster presentations and so on and so forth, but we have a paper in the pipe on a study that we've been working on about mystical experience. And as you'll see, mystical experience and its effects on a bunch of sort of cognitive metrics, insight, meaning in life, et cetera, all of that is going to also have sort of a significant inflection within this course because, it's very difficult to talk in its more advanced terms about Jungian studies without also talking about mystical experience and the significance of that kind of thing. My other theoretical interests, are pretty wide-ranging. I have broad interests. So I'm interested in mystical experiences, altered states more generally. I'm very interested in psychedelic research. So I've been a proponent of renewing the study of psychedelics for a decade. When I started talking about it, it was, I still got told things like, you can't look at this. It'll destroy your career. Since that time, that is no longer the case. Obviously, for those of you that are familiar with this material, the sort of psychedelic renaissance is well in swing at this point. There's just a raft of amazing work that sort of followed Griffith's work around psilocybin and mystical experience. Really kind of kicked off this whole thing and gave the field renewed respectability. So I've been involved with that. I've given some talks on that. If you are familiar with some of my other talks on YouTube and conference presentations. As I mentioned, I'm very interested in lucid dreaming and regular dreaming as well. So I do some theoretical work around dreaming and sort of neo-Jungian constructs around that. I'm also very strongly interested in role-playing games, which if you're familiar with them, this is games like sort of Dungeons & Dragons is the archetypal example, but they're role-playing games for countless genres and styles of play and so on and so forth. I've been a gamer for 37 years. 37 years. The bulk of which I have spent as a DM, a dungeon master. That's not an S&M thing in this context. It just means sort of the person who runs the game. We will, in fact, talk about gaming a little bit too. So I do some gaming work, some gaming writing. I do, in fact, a small amount of professional gaming, which is an amazing kind of thing to have in my basket. If I could high five my 12-year-old self through a time portal, I would definitely do that. I never thought I would be paid to be running Dungeons and Dragons, but indeed I do. I run some D&D camps for teens, and immediately prior to the pandemic, actually, I finally got a study that I had been interested in running up and going, which is looking at sort of social skill building and competence factors through tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. So we, among other things, we're looking at a bunch of factors, but the big thing is that we're looking at sort of autism spectrum and how people relate to gaming in that space. So we had just fired up that study. We were 2 weeks in, and then lockdown hit. So that's shelved, but nevertheless, that's a quite strong interest for me. And as you'll see, it contributes both to much of my work in cognitive science, as well as my work for reasons that will become clear in sort of neo-Jungian theory. In addition to that, let me think, what else? There are other things, plenty of other things. I'm involved with several not-for-profits. I'm involved in several startups. I like to get involved in things. If you go online, you can find, for instance, my involvement through U of T's Jungian Society. I was the president of the Jungian Society here for a number of years. And during sort of my tenure there, I helped organize the Mind Matters series of conferences, which I know a number of you have seen. Some terrific talks. We used to do sort of a thematic conference every year, so organized around sort of a big theme. And we would get, a bunch of relatively, high-profile local people and invite keynote speakers. They were always very well received, quite interesting. So we would get Jungian speakers and Buddhist speakers. That was a collaboration between the Jungian Society and the BPSU, the Buddhist Psychology Student Union, another great group if you don't know them. And some of those talks, among others, of course, Jordan Peterson has become, in the interim, exceptionally high profile, but he had some sort of terrific talks with us early on, if you're interested in that stuff. John Vervaeke spoke, I think, maybe every year at Mind Matters. Tony Toniato, who a number of you are familiar with, also a friend. Dan Dolderman, which some of you will know. He was faculty in psychology, positive psychology, lots of good speakers. So so the Mind Matters conferences, we did that for a while. What else? Oh, yeah, all right. I'm a private practice psychotherapist. So I'm a registered psychotherapist. My private practice is, used to be an in-person practice prior to lockdown. Now it is a virtual practice until the College of Psychotherapy sort of gives us the all clear. But I handle sort of in-person practice at my consulting office. So I maintain a consulting office separate from my home, and also international clients. So I have a robust practice. That's really sort of the backbone of my career. Much of the university thing is kind of a side gig that I do in part for, passion and interest in the material. I like being involved in things, and I like being involved at the university. So that's sort of my professional suite. In addition to that, I'm interested in a lot of other things. I've gotten very into making things. This is a strange thing, but 3D printers and poured epoxy and carving and sculpting and painting, and that's a relatively recent sort of sphere that I've become quite interested in. I used to be a professional writer, and as I already posted a link to, I'm a huge fan of the 3-day novel writing contest, which if you really want to put yourself through the ringer, you can try that. I highly recommend it. I've done it for more than 20 years now. And took third place a few years ago have shortlisted a bunch of times. So that's something I'm quite involved in. But I used to be a professional writer. I used to work in marketing. I used to work in insurance. I used to work in systems design. I used to do sort of high-level data mining stuff for banking. From my late teens to my early 20s, I was had a business. I was an inventor. That's a whole story. So yeah, so I like to do lots of different things. I have a very interdisciplinary stretch, less so than I used to be, just you know, on account of my schedule and sort of the gradual erosion of my reading skills by the internet. But I like to read very widely. I'm interested in lots and lots of subjects. That will become probably important to you, because if you're pitching a paper, you will find that I'm not especially dogmatic about coloring inside the lines of particular disciplines. Okay, basically I find virtually anything interesting, and if you can kind of construct an interesting argument that, you know, feels like it holds some water and you're making links, I'm, you know, generally speaking, willing to accept papers from all kinds of disciplines, provided that they relate to the subject matter of the course. So that also should become sort of, yeah, it'll become relevant to you, obviously, as we go ahead. Yeah, how did I come to Jung is a good question. So I've been interested in Jung since I was very young. That's terrible. But I didn't make the joke, welcome to the Jungle, and that's the groaner. Anyway, I've been interested in Jung since I was very young. I got into Jung when I was like a kid, really, and didn't understand it well. You know, I had started reading Jung when I was like 12, and I got some of it, but a lot of it went over my head. Jung is, quite frankly, as we'll discuss, a difficult read. Nevertheless, what I did grasp intrigued me, and there were certain things, you know, if you're kind of a geeky kid, and I was, right, you start to notice certain things about, say, patterns of human mythology and storytelling. So, for instance, you know, you start to notice that the pantheons, right, the groups of gods, the families of gods in different religions and traditions and cultures seem to have certain kinds of basic similarities. And that stuff starts to jump out at you after a while if you're reading a lot of it, you know, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, Egyptian mythology, etc. And so I became very interested in that. And likewise, you know, simultaneously, I noticed that there were quite similar patterns emerging in things like comic books, right? Role-playing games, films, films especially these days. Films have become sort of intensely archetypal and mythologically based, particularly since the rise of Marvel. And sort of the modern dominance of the superhero film. So noticing that there was these sort of threads through the culture that I was consuming really grabbed my attention. And Jung was the first theorist that I came across who provided an explanation. Now, I have issues to some extent with that explanation, which we'll start taking up next week. But the point is that, you know, Jung attempted to provide this framework, right? The collective unconscious and the notion of archetypes, which you could use to understand this stuff. And so I got interested in it really early. I read Jung quite a few times over the years. And I have the complete works, et cetera, lots and lots of stuff. And as I, you know, worked as a writer, it, you know, began to take on more and more prominence because it speaks somewhat to the sort of structural underpinnings of story, as we'll discuss, right? And as a lens of analysis. You know, if you read somebody in literary criticism, for instance, like Northrop Frye, it's hard to miss the kind of structural underpinnings and the relationship to Jungian thinking. And we'll discuss some of that as well. But yeah, when I finally entered training as a psychotherapist, later in I sort of began to really concertedly work in that direction in my late 20s, I trained, specifically speaking, as a registered psychotherapist, and my sort of the core of my training was emotion-focused therapy. But I always maintained a certain thread of depth psychology in my stance, and we'll get into why I think depth psychology in particular and psychodynamic theories, right, in general, offer a certain kind of perspective on cognition and on emotional health and development that isn't really addressed in a deep sense, okay, in some of the more modern formulations of therapy. So we will talk a little bit of therapeutic theory. Obviously, this isn't a course on therapeutic theory per se, but understanding the relationship between those things is important and interesting for sort of situating the material. So I trained in emotion-focused therapy, but always maintained a depth stance, and that very much carried forward into my practice. So my practice as a therapist is very sort of narrative-driven, and I maintain a relatively sort of strong focus on the archetypal, okay, and on, in some sense, the myths we live by, okay. You know, to take a sort of a Joseph Campbell Jungian stance, right? The fact that these patterns instantiate themselves within our lives and our situations, and they represent, in many cases, a sort of human universal. I take that stuff, you know, quite seriously. What else? Oh, magic. So for those of you that aren't familiar, also, I have a very strong academic interest in sort of esoteric studies, okay? So mysticism obviously sort of brushes up against that, but also magic in theory and practice. So, you know, my own background there is pretty varied. We'll probably discuss that a little bit as time goes on. But I've been involved in theoretical work around sort of trying to bring magical practices within a cognitive science framework. Jungian thinking plays a strong role in that. And I have an upcoming book that I'm still trundling along on the subject, as well as a book chapter that's about to be published in an anthology, hopefully soon. And I've done some conference presentations and talks and so on and so forth. Also, of course, I'm interested in where things like magic connect through to other sorts of esoteric practice. So Kabbalah, for instance, or really central in the sense we're talking about with Jungian thinking, alchemy, which is a very strong interest of mine, sort of in its classical forms and sort of the theoretical elaborations of those things. Again, if you've poked around inside my YouTube, you've probably seen me talk about that stuff. It's something I speak on fairly frequently. And you'll see some of that curve around, obviously, into the course too. So that interest in esoterics and in trying to bring esoterics and contemplative sciences, right, meditation, etc., into dialogue with our more modern understandings of the mind and of consciousness and of wisdom. So that's sort of my base of interest there. What else? I own guinea pigs. They're wonderful pets. I live in Toronto. I'm not from Toronto originally. I'm originally from Hamilton. I just made that thing, but it's just Hamilton used to not be so good. Hamilton seems kind of nice now. But yes, originally, and I grew up in Owen Sound up on the peninsula. So up in cottage country, where my family still lives. And that's probably as much biography as you are possibly going to be interested in, relative to me, at least at this point. Yeah, okay, so what else? We got 7 minutes. I'm not going to cover Jung in 7 minutes. So tell you what, you get a 7-minute break. It's like Pomodoro. Okay, so just to review. You've seen this. I do apologize for the upload issues. I think I have sorted that out. I have a new machine that I'm using for editing. I decided to kind of invest since our entire culture now occurs in like a Brady Bunch style gallery of you know, screens on Zoom and FaceTime and wherever. And I'm doing a lot more work around video. For those of you who are interested, I am also simultaneously working on an upcoming series that I'm going to be releasing on YouTube called Opus. And I have a few series in the pipe, but Opus is sort of first on the block that's going to deal really specifically with alchemy and with cognitive science and the interrelationships between those things, especially sort of within a kind of Vervaekian mold and within my own work, my own theoretical elaborations. So that's upcoming. For those of you that are into the material, obviously it's not required viewing, but it may be of interest to you. So yeah, that'll be coming out soon. Right, okay, so, right, the upload thing. So I invested in a computer. The computer is a considerably more powerful editing machine than my laptop. So, you know, I've got a setup going, which hopefully I should be able to use next week. I think the process fell prey to me forgetting how long it takes to upload and code things. I think I maybe had an issue with the VPN that I'm using. And the file sizes. So I was doing some stuff in HD. If I can get around that, I will anyway. So you can see like every individual cell of my skin, if that's what you want. Otherwise, if I can't, well, then standard definition will have to do. Yeah. Okay. So, so for starting next week, we'll be jumping in on Carl properly. So we'll do a bit of biographical background, not too much. Many of you, I hope, have already begun reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is his autobiography. If not, I hope you've jumped in on Introducing Jung, which, as I mentioned, is an excellent introduction text, okay, just to sort of get a basic, you know, framework in place with which to understand this stuff. Yeah, we'll start in on Jung next week. And like I said, I'm going to limit myself to 2 hours of lecture a week. That sounds like a lot, but it really isn't. You know, I had a course that was a 2-hour lecture at one time. I had them bump it up to 3 hours, which I'm sure thrilled my students. But for me, it's useful. Typically, there's a lot of material that I want to cover. However, I understand that, you know, whatever, people's time is limited, even when this is asynchronous and you have the opportunity to watch this at your own pace. So I'm limiting myself to 2 hours a week. And, you know, Scout's honor. I was never a Scout, but Scout's honor. Okay, so good. General introductions. I hope that people will also introduce themselves. Like I said, next week, I will activate the discussion board, and I'm gonna sort of throw out an introductory, you know, piece. Maybe I'll even do it before. And so I'll just tell you about the introductory piece now. All I want people to do to introduce themselves on the discussion board is post a meme. It doesn't even have to be a Jungian meme. We'll get to that later. Just post a meme. Something that is, you know, something that means something to you, where you're at, what's on your mind, what you're into, whatever, okay? You don't have to worry about, you know, totally general audience, and obviously stay away from things that are patently offensive. But the idea is, you know, this is just getting the ball rolling on who's who and, you know, what we're about, et cetera, et cetera. I'll look for some. Memes are not a primary mode of communication for me. I think I'm old, and that's why. But I'll try to jump in, and of course, I don't want to presume that it's a primary mode of communication for you, but, you know, demographics being what they are, my assumption is that most of you who are present in the course are fluent in memetics. That is the term. I don't know if that applies to memes in this sense, rather than Dawkins memes. Okay, that's a conversation for another day. But so, yeah, tell you what, I'm gonna activate that discussion board. It might already be active. I'll start a thread, probably today. And yeah, if people just want to introduce themselves by posting a meme, that would be good. We can get the ball rolling and just some general discussion in the course. Okay, so with all that said, Friday, right, as I mentioned, office hours, I'll be on Zoom starting at noon. If you want to pop in, you can introduce yourself if you want. And if you have any questions about stuff that's on the syllabus, for instance, I will be happy to answer that. If you have questions about general course material, I'll be happy to answer that, and always just happy to discuss. I like talking about this stuff. So, okay, look at that. You didn't really get a Pomodoro. You got a minute 30, so you can run to the bathroom or whatever. But nevertheless, okay, so that's who I am. That's the course structure. Jung begins next week. I hope you all have a terrific weekend, and I will see some of you in office hours, you know, Friday at noon.